Welcome, welcome, everyone. This is Legal Insights, DEI for Real, where we reassure, educate, activate, and lead. And your co-hosts, two of us anyway. I'm Chris Jones, one of the co-founders and owner of Spectra Diversity. We have an inclusion assessment that measures both the individual and the organization at the same time with qualitative and quantitative data. And my partner is Nancy.
I'm Nancy Schick of Third Ear Conflict Resolution. I am a New York State employment attorney and global workplace mediator who is 100% focused on keeping workplace disputes out of court.
And our guest today, we have on the left, Paolo. He came into DEI from an unusual background with advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and neuroscience. So he likes to joke that he had already done rocket science and brain surgery before turning to a really complex problem: diversity, equity, and inclusion. His extensive background spans business, technology, academia, with the ultimate goal of making our society more inclusive and equitable. A former tenured professor turned entrepreneur, he's the chief scientist of Aleria, president of ARC, and chairman of the annual Diversity Inclusion Research Conference. And that picture, the reason I put that picture up there is because I had attended DIRC every year since 2019 when it was live. And I was just so excited to meet Paolo in person that I was just like a little fangirl there. And he is the award-winning book, author of Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. On your right is Cynthia Overton. She's an author, speaker, and advocate for person-centered care. Her perspective is shaped by her experience after a rare spinal cord injury led to 7 weeks in 3 hospitals, where she sought high-quality care, negotiated with insurance companies, relearned to walk, and transitioned into life with a disability. That journey inspired her book, Clear Cane Chronicles, Shaping the Future of Healthcare Through Person-Centered Care, and ongoing work to develop a digital companion to support that book. Together, Paolo and Cynthia are co-authors of a forthcoming book, and I already ordered mine, Meritocracy, How to Manage Talent for Higher Profits and Happier People. Welcome.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction.
That was really great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Nance. Saying before we got started, it almost feels like this is a family reunion, and it's just great to be reconnected with everybody again.
Well, and I didn't include the huddle part of it, which is, we've come a long way since the huddle, when we were literally afraid to come out in favor of DEI. We had to keep it kind of secret and small. And now it's like we're just out there.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and I'm going to get it started. This will be pretty quick. No, you are not. This is the real part. No, you are not imagining it. Project 2025 has 320 total objectives. 34 agencies are involved, and it is 52% complete. Imagine, as much as has been happening, there's 48% more. NPR reported that in 2023, U.S. employers eliminated more than 2,600 jobs with the words diversity or DEI in the titles or description. A lot of people are rebranding and shifting roles. This has happened with a lot of the colleagues that I've been working with. Some have gotten out of DEI completely. One is a lifestyle coach. A lot of them are doing other kinds of coaching. Some got out of the business entirely. So many companies are eliminating the work and moving it away. They're rebranding from the DEI label. And then, like I said, many professionals are shifting into HR or other roles. And then another thing that has happened is higher education bans. Several states have passed legislation banning DEI offices in public colleges, some removing them entirely. And one of the unintended consequences of this is that some of the elite universities used to have a 50-50 rule. They had to accept 50% women, 50% men. Well, because women were applying in larger numbers, that means it was easier for men to get in. So in their effort to fix DEI, they're going to be having more women on campus than men, because not only do women apply more than men, they tend to have higher scores. So take that. Okay, Nancy, the legal recap.
So as we've been talking about, we did the Ames case. I think we did it last month. Just a reminder that there is no heightened standard for any type of discrimination. If you're not familiar with the Ames case, of course, you can go back and watch last month's webinar and learn more about that. I've also taught a law line CLE for that. But the bottom line is everybody gets treated by the same standard. That's what the Supreme Court came down with in the Ames case. So we're not looking at what they used to, which was what were the background circumstances. If you were perceived to be in the majority class, there had been a practice in some of the circuit courts of asking whether you had proof, basically offering a burden of proof that up front that said, yeah, my employer was one of those rare ones that discriminated against the majority. And the Supreme Court said that doesn't apply anymore. Everybody gets the same standard. So in the Ames case, just again, to a reminder, what she won at the Supreme Court level was not her case, but the right for her case to be heard.
Okay, and also equal standing.
And pretty much everybody is on equal standing in the workplace. We know that's it in legalese, but probably not necessarily in practicum. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, is what does that look like and what is the impact on employers. There's been a lot of talk about the EEOC video that came out in December, encouraging white men in particular to file cases if they think that they've been discriminated against. And so far, we haven't seen the big flood that we're anticipating. And the reason for that is they still have to prove their case, right? So it's still everybody is now on equal standing, which means everybody still has to prove their case. So even though it allows more cases to go forward that might not have before, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to win. There still has to be evidence to support the claim.
And this just happened on February 26th. There was a letter that went out to Fortune 500 corporate leaders. And the EEOC chair, Andrea Lucas, had this to say: I urge corporate America to reject identity politics as its solution to society's ills. The only lawful way to stop discrimination on the basis of race or sex is to stop discriminating on the basis of race or sex. Protecting workers begins with preventing discrimination. The EEOC is committed to helping businesses comply with the law, hiring workers based on their merit, excellence, and character, not skin color or sex, is the right thing to do and benefits employers and employees alike. And yeah, hiring workers based on their merit, excellence, and character. And that
I believe we have a couple of experts here that might be able to help us with this.
Let's get to them. Educate. So, Paolo, this is all you. What does DEI get right and what does it get wrong?
Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, is he muted? Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't usually make that mistake, but thank you. I was trying to avoid making noise. But anyway, so first of all, thank you for the introductory comments. And I think it'll be fun to hear Cynthia and me talk about these ideas from slightly different perspectives. And it's been really a wonderful experience writing the second book with her on meritocracy. And there's one thing, I don't want to go into a ton of detail, and I see, thank you for having that slide, is these are the definitions that I gave in my first book on measuring inclusion, which actually, as you can see right here, it's coming from the point of view of the organization, and which is to say, how an organization is behaving, and as opposed to how an employee is feeling. And I'll explain why I mean that. But from the organization's point of view, what I suggest is that one way of defining the terms of DEI is to say that inclusion is what we do, diversity is what we get, and equity is what we want. And I just want to focus for a moment on one aspect of this, which is that I started to work in DEI in 2015, so about 11 years ago. And I came at it from an unusual analytical angle that really is a methodology to understand the link between individuals and whatever organization or society they're part of. And one of the things that became apparent to me fairly early on was that there were some issues in DI, one of them being that the focus on diversity first is a bit of a challenge because it can lead to, I won't use any adjectives, let's say white men, to complain about being discriminated against. I talk about reverse discrimination, but also because more generally, what I realized that diversity is really an outcome. It's the result of everything that happens in the organization. Inclusion, one of the problems that I had with inclusion was the fact that I started to look around and realize that there were no consistent, systematic, agreed upon definitions of the word inclusion. And I think that if I were to ask 10 different people how they define inclusion, I would get 10 different answers. And then fast forward to the present, and I think, Cynthia, I would love for you to kind of chime in on that as well. But one of the things that we realized when we started to work on this book was that meritocracy similarly is not defined by anybody. It's like you ask 10 people to define meritocracy, and some of them will say it's about being colorblind, it's about hiring the best candidate, it's about rewarding people adequately for their efforts, it's about this and that and the other. But there's no agreed upon definition. And most importantly, there is no agreed upon definition that is actually measurable in a way that it can be linked to both the success of individuals in an organization and the success of the organization as a whole. So let me stop there with these kind of high level comments, and Cynthia, please take it away.
No, I mean, I agree with everything that you just said. And I think that kind of, the way that I think about, the society in which we live, and there is kind of a lot of disparities that we have seen, historical disparities based on actual law and policies. And I think that in an effort to kind of address many of those issues and the lingering impacts with DEI. I do think that we have gotten a lot right in terms of really acknowledging that this is an issue, but there's a lot that I would say that there's an opportunity to improve on. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the book that really builds on Paulo's first book is that we're really taking another look at both DEI and meritocracy, and really looking at moving forward from a systems level or a systems framework. So instead of really focusing on individualized behaviors, we're really looking at how systems work to either, provide opportunities for people to be successful or just have these factors baked in that cause some people to fail.
One of the examples that I like that I've heard you give before, Paolo, is that, and this is measuring inclusion, not meritocracy, but you measure inclusion by measuring actually exclusion. It's like if you're healthy, you don't notice all the people that are sick because you're not. But once you're sick, you notice all the other people that have what you have, whether it's, depression or which would be a mental issue or some other kind of invisible issue. Can you talk to that a little bit, Paolo?
Yeah, no, thank you. I have that. This was sort of a realization that we got years ago, starting to work in the space, was the idea that inclusion itself is invisible, and that what people tend to notice are situations when you are not being included. And we drew an analogy with health that I think is appropriate in a lot of ways. As you were pointing out, if you're a very healthy person, you don't know a lot about disease. You don't know the names. You don't know the severity of the symptoms. You also don't know how to cure it. And inclusion in a lot of ways works similarly. You tend not to notice when you're healthy. You tend to notice when you are, or you're not. You tend not to notice when you're included. You tend to notice when you're excluded. And just like in the case of health, those that are very healthy don't know a lot about disease. In the case of inclusion, the people that are least excluded are the ones that are less likely to understand what exclusion means, less likely to understand the severity of it, and certainly the least likely to know what to do about it. Unfortunately, where health is something that hits pretty much everybody in the population, exclusion tends to hit only certain parts of the workforce. And so the very people that we trust to make decisions for us are the ones that are the most included, and therefore they're the ones that are the least familiar with the idea of exclusion. They're the least likely to understand the severity of the symptoms, and they're by far the least qualified to do anything about it. And I think that this is, like, to me, this was a profound realization, because I saw the contrast between speaking to a lot of people who look like me, white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, who run companies, who given the opportunity, they would love to do the right thing. They would love to understand what the problem was and understand how to fix it, but they felt that they just didn't know what was going on. They couldn't tell. And so I think that understanding that in many cases, and again, I don't want to be an apologist for white supremacists, and there are plenty of them, but I think that there's also a very large swath of the population that is not refusing to do things because they don't believe in it, because they don't believe in DEI. It's just because they don't know how to make sense of it, and they don't have the right tools, and they're being pointed in a million directions by different people. So that analogy has stayed with me for a long time. I still talk about it a lot, and there's other kind of follow-ons to that, but in general, those are the two main points of equating health and inclusion with, and then sickness and exclusion as being kind of parallels.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that. And that's kind of something that I struggle with, because in my mind, we kind of have different camps and different ways that people perceive this work. And at the end of the day, you are going to have your, folks who are advancing Project 2025. And, there's just not much that can be done, because there's just a whole different agenda that, my little voice isn't going to make a difference in. But then there's the population that Paulo's talking about, in terms of folks who, are interested in kind of, I don't know if you'd say, doing the right thing. They're pulled in a million directions. And at the end of the day, many of them are not going to have conversations with people like me. And so just kind of not being able to be in the room, be privy to those discussions is a little disheartening. However, I will also say that's probably one of the biggest benefits of having a collaborator like Paulo, in terms of we're able to kind of balance each other out and fill gaps that the other has in terms of the experiences and the exposure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If I could,
I talk
oh,
about
sorry, go
that.
ahead, Nancy. Go ahead. No.
Well, I actually wanted to ask you, Paolo, a specific question. And I'm sure, Cynthia, you may have an opinion on this as well,
I
based on your
probably do.
experience. Because I've worked with a lot of upper level executives, risk managers, lots of people in all sorts of large corporations who are in those positions of influence. And one of the biggest challenges I think they have, even when they're well intended, is the lack of willingness to go to the uncomfortable conversations, because of how uncomfortable they get with challenging everything that we think, myself included. I've had this, right, where I've had to look at, how have I gotten where I've gotten? And even though I came up from very little and struggled, and just like so many people, we have to take on, like, the fact that there was a path for us that wasn't available to everyone. And I think that's the conversation that we don't have. Are you finding that that's part of it? It's the, like, it's a human nature, right? To stop and go, wait, I have to look at my life and accept that maybe I had some advantages that other people didn't, and that's why I'm successful. And does your book address that?
Well, I'm gonna start with a small parenthesis that kind of links what Cynthia just said with what you just asked, which is that one of the reasons why I've absolutely just loved working with Cynthia, and we've had, I would say, Cynthia, I've had some uncomfortable conversations. I think one of the things that's been great is that we are very extremely candid and transparent, and I think that we both recognize that much of what we do and say is shaped by our lived experiences, and you can't blame someone for not seeing things your way just because they've had different lived experiences than you have, right? And I think Cynthia and I are both very respectful of the other person's point of view, understanding that we come at it from two completely different viewpoints. And to that, I want to say, this whole thing about uncomfortable conversations, I want to give a bit of a word of caution, which is that this is my impression, and I'm going to be very clear, based on my experience as a white man, okay, which I realize is not necessarily a universal viewpoint. A lot of what happened, especially after the murder of George Floyd, was focused or seemed to be focused on kind of like what you were saying, Nancy, which is we want people to understand what it's like not to be wearing these particular shoes, right? But sometimes I wonder how beneficial that is. It's like you can't really guilt. It's not necessarily about guilting, but people are not just going to suddenly go like, oh my God, I see now that you've been mistreated and that's wrong, etc. Even if they see that, understanding how to go from that to actually acting the right way can be very, very challenging. And the one thing that I think has characterized my work that got me very excited about it in the first place 11 years ago was the realization that there is an opportunity to use data in a very different way than most people use data to link for people like me the well-being of their talent with the financial success of the organization in a way that completely bypasses the question of who was done wrong, who was done right, who's got the privilege, who doesn't have the privilege, who's a vulnerable group, who's not a vulnerable group. Forget all of that. And by forget all that, I don't mean that it doesn't matter, but what I mean is that that's not, in my opinion, what's going to be convincing a business leader whose job at the end of the day depends on one and only one thing, which is how much money are they making for their company. And so I tend to be very cautious about, as much as I love having these difficult conversations with Cynthia, and they're not always difficult, by the way. Sometimes they're like, I would say 80% of the time we agree vehemently. 10% of the time we kind of disagree. And then the other 10%, well, we're like, okay, we agree to disagree, if you will, right? But anyway, so I would just be a little bit cautious about, again, that urge to want to explain things to people. And the fact that unfortunately, in my opinion, it can open people's minds a little bit, but it doesn't lead them to action, is my experience.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think that to your point, Chris, earlier is that, we talk about having uncomfortable conversations. And as a society, that's just not how we were brought up. I mean,
Right.
in the kindergarten, we learned how to be nice. We had the little list, and then that was it. And I think that many of us, regardless of background, kind of struggle when it comes to really engaging and really understanding the point of view of the person with whom you're speaking. And I think that it's just like you said, human nature. And at the end of the day, who enjoys being told that they're doing something wrong? Who enjoys being told that they're doing something wrong publicly? Um, so I mean, I think that there's just also kind of a lot of factors in play here.
And that is a good segue to to what is our strategery? This is from the DEI board, which is a dedicated group of leaders, often those senior executives that are responsible for DEI and implementing strategies that foster an inclusive, fair, and equitable environment. And you can see that their two biggies are leadership and culture, and behind it is talent. Metrics, reporting, and learning programs all got less than 40%. So, so my question, since these are, what their strategic priorities are, how do we make these strategic priorities actionable in any way?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Well, and how
Yes.
do we make them actionable in an era of AI?
That's a great question. Yeah. Although I'm a big believer that AI has a lot of potential to teach us to be more human by taking some of those robotic, repetitive tasks back out of our day-to-day work. But it also comes with a lot of extra. So I'm in that camp of like, I see some benefit, but is it worth it? I'm still weighing, right? But I think that's a a big question, right? How are we going to do this going forward?
Well, let's get to that. Brings up where we are. There's a person a gentleman that I follow on LinkedIn, Vikram Shetty, and he says that metrics tell you where you are, money tells you why it matters, and the map, which would be the strategy, tells you what to do next. So, question for Paolo and Cynthia, how do, well, this is the same question I just asked, essentially. How do they navigate the risk, reduce operational friction, maybe unlock a competitive advantage by fostering, a meritocracy? What can be done?
Yeah, and for me, I kind of go back and I would love for Paulo to be able to, talk about this in more detail. But to me, I really kind of go back from focusing on individuals to focusing on systems and having systems in place that can help to make things fair.
And that gets to the definition.
Yeah.
What is inclusive meritocracy?
Yeah. Okay. I gotta.
And you got a whole book to tell it. So
No, no. I mean, look. So I'm gonna tell a bit of an anecdote. I'm sure you all have seen. There have been different versions of this analogy, but a lot of times the idea of runners on a racetrack is used to argue for the importance of things like affirmative action, right? And I've seen different versions of it, but one version that I've used is imagine that a race starts, like a 10K race, and the runners take off and they go around the first corner. They realize that there are obstacles on some of the tracks, but not on some of the other tracks, and so very quickly, some of the racers that didn't have obstacles get ahead of the others. The judges, seeing this, they get rid of the obstacles for the next lap, but they realize that it wouldn't be fair. So what they do is they stop temporarily the race, allow everybody to catch up, and then they keep going. And that, when you frame it that way, it sounds eminently reasonable. Well, I was part of a debate about a year and a half ago between a pro-DEI and anti-DEI person, and the other person, I didn't use that analogy, but the other person gave an analogy that was eerily similar. He said, imagine there is a race, the runners go off, the faster runners are getting ahead of the other ones, and the judges stop everybody and they let the slower runners catch up so that everybody can finish at the same time. This is what DEI wants. They want everybody to finish at the same time, regardless of their skills. And when I heard that, my jaw dropped, because it's like, how can you have two nearly identical analogies that come up to opposite conclusions? And what finally I realized was that the problem is that they're based on tacit, unstated assumptions that are reflecting the individual lived experiences. So those of us, well, I shouldn't say those of us, those people who have suffered discrimination and disparities, who have been the targets of that, they see things in a certain way. And so to them, the assumption is, yeah, there are obstacles along the tracks of some people, but not others. And while the other people are making this, the meritocracy people are making the assumption that the reason why some runners are ahead is because they're faster. A proper analogy would be, I walk into a stadium in the middle of a race, I see that some racers are in front of the others, and I see that the judges stop everyone. But I don't know whether there were obstacles on the track, and I don't know whether the people in front were there because they were faster or because there were obstacles on the track. What does that all mean? Well, when you believe in meritocracy, in principle, the idea of meritocracy is that there will be, as long as you have equal opportunities, there will be unequal outcomes. The cream rises to the top. The best people win. That's the fundamental tenet of meritocracy. So when you tell somebody who claims to be a meritocracy person that you want equity, not just equality, but you want equality of outcomes, you're basically saying your entire world is wrong. We should all finish at the same time. Now, what I think most people really want to say is, we want to make sure that if we're putting in the same amount of contribution to a company and we have the same skills, then we should have the same outcomes, right? But the problem is that if we don't state that assumption up front, it creates a problem. And this is where, when Cynthia and I were writing the book, we had this realization. If you see a disparity in outcomes, let's say in a company, how would you know whether it's because it's a meritocracy functioning properly, that's rewarding the best people, or if it's because of the fact that there is some kind of discrimination? And the problem is that right now people are just assuming that, well, the only way you can know that is that you need to measure two things. You need to measure the outputs and make sure that they don't depend on anything irrelevant, but you also need to measure the opportunities. And it turns out that the opportunities is what we've been calling inclusion, and the outcomes is what we're now calling merit, we used to call equity. In other words, you have to measure both the opportunity and the outcome. In other words, you need to have both inclusion that gives everybody the same opportunity, and you need to have meritocracy or merit, which ensures that the best people rise to the top. So there's no such thing as meritocracy unless you're taking care of both, which is why we use the term inclusive meritocracy instead of like true meritocracy, real meritocracy, whatever, where we literally mean unless you're measuring both sides of that particular equation, you don't know what you're talking about. You're simply making assumptions.
And I think this is where Cynthia, you probably jump in, right, with addressing the systems, because what I'm hearing, and based on my own experience with various organizations, is that a lot of it comes down to not even having clear rules. So you go back to even that road race, right? And if you have somebody that's never run in a race and doesn't know that you're supposed to stagger so that people are, running the same distance on the track and all of that, that of course it's going to result in inequities. And so I think that's a big part of it as well, is knowing, does everybody have access to the same rules? Are the people that are training the runners also training them under the same rules? And are they looking at merit? Do the runners all have the same opportunities, the same nutrition, the same shoes, this, right? All of those things. And I think it's just a lot more complicated. So what I a lot of times work with my clients on is starting from what are the standards and what are the results you're trying to get, and then engaging the employees in how do we get there together. And I think
Yeah.
that's where you come in, Cynthia,
Well,
correct?
yeah, and it's just so interesting because when we think about environments, particularly within the workplace, oftentimes there are a lot of rules. They're just unwritten rules. And
Exactly.
and the issue is with no real structure in place, it's almost kind of like the wild, wild west, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes it's kind of fate that determines what's going on in the experiences that people have. But at the end of the day, without the rules and structures, it's just very hard to facilitate a truly inclusive work environment. And you think about even, people who are in positions of leadership. Oftentimes they get there not necessarily because they're an outstanding leader, it's because they're a content specialist. And folks just oftentimes don't even have the inherent management or leadership skills needed to help run effective teams. And when we are looking at things, holistically, when it comes to an organization, an absence of policies, procedures, and structures, it just makes it very challenging for folks to operate within an inclusive meritocracy.
Nancy, what kind of actions could result in a legal backlash to an organization that's trying to do a meritocracy, inclusive meritocracy?
Well, if they're doing it correctly and they're watching for the any kind of disparate impact, right? Even though I know that's still something that's being challenged at the federal level, and we may not see as many claims for disparate impact, you still have a lot of state opportunities, even if you don't go the federal route. So I would say you still want to look for, are there inequitable results within your organization? And Chris, how many times have we said this in the webinars over the past, year or so? Is it really comes down to that, is you need to measure, poll your employees, talk to your employees, find out where they perceive the inequities, and then measure to see if that perception is accurate. And if not, you still have to address it. You don't just come back and go, well, we measured it, so you're wrong, right? That usually doesn't go over real well with employees. So I think it's coming back to that, is the disparate impact would be one of the big ones. I think as far as also looking at meritocracy in, I think, Paolo, you've hit on it pretty clearly, and Cynthia, you as well, that you have to consider how you're measuring it. Where do those measurements come from? And even back to the AI, right? You can use that as an example of how if you are going in and building something, not checking your own biases, you're going to more than likely create something that does discriminate. You have to do a lot of that background work when you're building.
What about,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
well, I was just wondering about inconsistent investment in employees. Some get to go to the, maybe they're designated as a high potential employee, and some get to go to, um, workshops or out of town trips for team building or whatever. Is inconsistent investment in employees, is that an issue that would cross the line?
It could, and again, it comes back to how do you define a high potential employee? What kinds of objective criteria are you using, right? Objective criteria is key. But even then, where did you come up with that? And a lot of times what happens then when these cases get to court, it's that people went with their gut. They didn't use an objective measurement in any way. They said, well, they seem like they would fit in well here, or I liked them, or I went
I
with my
love
gut,
that.
right? Yeah, don't trust your gut. Give me the evidence.
Yeah.
Paolo, you were going to say something?
Well, I mean, I was going to say something that's the one thing that I would, this is my own recommendation, and I know that it may sound a little bit weird, but I strongly encourage people to try to think in a somewhat different way about the way to approach the problems, which is what I see very commonly is one of two approaches. One of them is let's find the most vulnerable group and find out what things are happening to that group, and then let's try to figure out how to improve the problems. Or a different kind of approach is a bit like, Chris, what you were in a sense exemplifying when you said, well, what about the amount of money that we invest into employee development? And there is a tendency to focus on like the narrow problem and then try to see, well, then we can broaden it out. One of the things that I'm very proud of, that's kind of inadvertently come out of the work with measure inclusion that is also now in the meritocracy work, is that we try to flip that whole argument upside down. Instead of bucketing, in the case of inclusion, instead of bucketing people by identity, let's bucket problems by the nature of the problem. So we start by categorizing problems to things like work-life balance, compensation and benefits, participation, and so on and so forth. And then we find quantitatively, we get data to say, where are the biggest problems happening? And let's focus on fixing the biggest problems. And as it turns out, and this is universally found, if you fix the biggest problems, you are naturally going to have the greatest positive impact on the most vulnerable populations. Because, the biggest problems are things like not being included in meetings in which you belong. And guess who that happens to? And in general, we find that those problems of exclusion very easily go with that. And with meritocracy, we're doing something very similar. Instead of saying, oh, let's think of ways that we may be evaluating things wrongly and not really being a meritocracy, let's try this idea, that idea. We came up with this idea in the book and Cynthia already kind of hinted at this idea of looking at systems, looking at processes, looking at policies, looking at resources. And then let's find, for example, let's look at all the processes that we do. Let's look at promotions, for example. Let's look at performance evaluations. Performance evaluations is one of those processes that impacts many, many, many different things that happen in the organization, because they impact project assignments, they impact bonuses, they impact raises, they impact promotion. And so if you start for thinking from the system problem at system level, thinking about the processes, the policies, the practices, the resources that are involved, in organizations that enable employees to succeed, then that's where you need to measure merit. You need to make sure that the way that people go through those various processes is independent of things that ought to be irrelevant. Not just gender and race. It could be how many years you've been in the company. It could be whether you're working remotely or on site. It could be what school you went to. It could be what language you speak. It could be what religion you follow, right? I mean, any of those markers, if you see that there is a difference in promotions, in the way the resources are assigned, in task allocation, then you can say, okay, there may be a problem here. And then you go dig in and you say, okay, let's find the problem, see what it's like, and let's fix it. So our, the suggestion that we have in both books is flip that script. Don't start by focusing on vulnerable populations first. Don't start by trying to solve a particular problem, thinking, oh, this we think is a really big problem, let's try to fix it. Instead, think about the mechanisms that happen within the organization and the actual classes of forms of exclusion that happen. And then that way you're kind of working in reverse.
And
And
I
you're
think
avoiding
that
all this backlash. You're avoiding all of the guilt and, and the, the identity first things that are the subject of so many, legal attacks now.
And I think that kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier, kind of like what we got right, what we got wrong in terms of DEI. And I think that one of the issues is that, we did really focus a lot on what was happening to individuals, and those experiences really, really, really hard to face at times. But a lot of times we look at fixing issues for individuals as opposed to looking at the system to understand what's allowing those situations to happen.
And if you don't measure, you don't know. I had one assessment where literally 20% of the people commented how unhappy they were with the dress code. Well, dress code, just fix it. That's not like the biggest thing in the world. You can fix it and make 20% of the people happier.
Yeah.
And it's true. It starts with things like that you don't realize. That's why we ended up with Crown laws, right? Is because people didn't realize that they were perpetuating certain discrimination and didn't know because
Crown
it was the
laws?
way it was already been done. The Crown laws for hair, right?
Natural
So
hair.
natural hair.
Oh,
And men wearing, like Sikh men wearing longer hair, Black women wearing natural hair, right? Because of the history of discrimination. That's a whole another webinar. But the other one that comes to mind, as you mentioned, where you went to school and things like that too. And we've had a lot of conversations in my world about how a lot of women, for example, end up going to maybe state schools or community college and then not necessarily taking on the debt of an Ivy League school, although they might have the capacity for going to that, but made different choices. And so a lot of women and minorities end up being overlooked because of where they went to school. So we really need to look at lots of different things beyond just identifying who you think might be suffering from some sort of discrimination in your workplace. And I wanted to bring that up because the other thing you have to be careful of is that by identifying a group and then targeting them for these changes without measuring, you run the risk of perceiving them as being less than without them actually having any objective evidence that they're not underperforming. So you need the data to make sure you're fixing the right problems.
okay. And I have some examples, but I want to be cognizant of the time here. So I'm going to skip a couple. The first one was somebody that thought that the executive should stop cowering. I'm going to do this one. So this is an anonymous comment from one of our surveys. Quote, I feel included because I get to come to work, do my work, earn a paycheck, and go home. I feel that I am afforded the same opportunity as my other colleagues and have earned my place in the company based on merit rather than my culture, race, gender, or sexual preference. Any reactions to that?
Yeah,
I earned it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of comments like that, and I can tell you, statistically speaking, I have a pretty good idea of the race and gender of the person that wrote that comment. just a wild guess, but we see that all the time. We see it all the time. It's but again, I want to, I could read to you like literally dozens and dozens and dozens of comments from people, and because it's my data, I can say largely from white men, occasionally from white women, but definitely largely from people that are very highly privileged. And the thing that I want to keep in mind is that this is not, you cannot know what you don't know. You cannot know what a disease feels like, you know, what an illness feels like unless you've actually held that illness. And so I think that for some of these people, like some of these people that I know, well-meaning progressives, right? They genuinely mean well, and they genuinely don't understand it and don't see it. And you know, what can you do about that? Well, what you can do is you collect the right kind of data and you show it to the people that matter. I can tell you there have been a couple of times in my experience when we've done these inclusion assessments in the past where we collect a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. And the qualitative data is in the form, we ask people to share experiences, very detailed, specific experience of things that interfered with their ability to do their work. We don't say that made you feel excluded. We just want to know, tell us about stuff that happened to you at work. And on 2 occasions, when we presented the results to leaders who happened to be white and male, on 2 occasions, they basically started to cry and saying, I cannot believe that this kind of shit is happening under my watch, quite literally. And it's very powerful when you do that, you know, and I would say it's that aspect of it, but there has to be a second very, very important aspect, which is that I don't want to say at the end of the day, as a leader, if you find out that there's something going on in your organization that is unsavory, you may feel bad about it. But if your company is performing well financially, you might just shrug your shoulder and say, I don't know what to do about it. It would be nice to fix this problem. If you go back to the same leader and you say, because this is happening to these people with this frequency, you're losing $1.3 million a year that you would not otherwise be losing, it's a very different story. And that's one of the things that I always encourage my colleagues in DI when I hear them say, you know, wouldn't it be nice to have an organization that is fair and equitable? What I say is, that's not what you should talk about. You should say, wouldn't it be nice to have an organization that is fair and equitable so that your employees can be more productive and you can make more money? Because ultimately and I think that this is something that I can say is a fairly general issue. I'm drawing in broad paint strokes here, right? But there is this tendency to ask our target customers, if you will, to buy our product because we think that they should. Instead of, let's think about what they need and how can we rephrase what we do in a way that will actually align with their interest, not just in vacuous words, but actually truly align in their interest. And if I have to say, if there's one way that I think as we move forward to the future, we can all improve, is by being more mindful about that, being more mindful about using the right language to motivate the discovery of what's going on, but more importantly, use the right language to motivate people to take actions that are aligned with their own interests.
It's the same principles that we see in sales.
Right. And also in this, and not just what they're speaking their language, but also talking to them within their realm of authority, right? A lot of times we want people to fix society's ills, but they don't necessarily have the authority and that level of power. I wish I did. I'd make it all go away, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to go to skip the other stories because we've kind of covered a lot of it, and go to the lead portion. So this is, I've got a few bullet points here, and please, Cynthia and Paolo, add to them as you choose. One thing to do is measure. Qualitative and quantitative. I always tell my clients to measure vertically. Don't just measure your leaders, because if you measure your leaders, and I've seen this in our data, is that leaders tend to overestimate in terms of culture and management and policies, practices, and procedures. So if you just measure the leaders, you're getting, the rose-colored glasses view. So measure vertically. If you have to pick a slice of your company, do it vertically, not horizontally. Any comments on measuring? We love measuring.
Well, I think it's like measuring your Fitbit, right? You still have to figure out what to do with all that data eventually.
Yeah.
It's like it's not enough to just collect it.
No, you have to turn it into strategies and actions somehow. Okay, next one, communicate and be visible and involved. So this is, leaders and managers build trust by showing up. And clear communication, defined outcomes, and their KPIs and whatnot. Active involvement sends a powerful message and it builds trust and credibility. I have a quick story is I was the international president of a professional organization. We had about 10,000 members. And every year we had an annual banquet, big old banquet. And it used to be that the board of directors and the regional vice presidents all sat at, up at the front at round tables. And I said, during my year, I said, no, we're going to put one of you at each one of the tables for the entire room, so that even though the participants won't be able to know all of the board members of the RPs, they'll know one, and they will have, that one connection. And it was just a way to be visible and involved. Any comments there?
Amen to that.
Paolo?
No, completely agree. I mean, communication. I can tell you one thing. I'm just adding to something that you've basically already said. I was just meeting actually early today with an organization that is interested in doing an inclusion assessment, and they had a bad taste in their mouth from a prior survey that they'd done a few years ago. And one of the real problems that came through was the fact that there was no communication, meaning that they went in, the leadership organized the survey or commissioned the survey, got the data, and then didn't really know what to do or say, and so they said nothing. And one of the things that we always try to encourage people to say is to say, look, if you're going to make the commitment to if you're going to ask people to make the commitment and to be vulnerable and to tell you what's happening, you have to show that you're actually going to value the responses. And even if you end up saying, you know what, we cannot do anything about it right now, but at least show that you're engaging, that you're communicating, that you're sharing ideas. And that's absolutely crucial at all levels, not just that example. So completely agree with you on both the measuring and the communication.
And I just want to add to that, it's really important not to dismiss the or I would say conceal the issues that came up that you might not necessarily like or agree with, which is something that I have seen. You get negative reactions, and then all of a sudden there was something wrong with the methodology. It was like everything except for the reality that employees were having.
Well, and I would say I'll add to that also that just real quickly that there's almost always something that can be done about the results. It might not be you can do a whole overhaul, but it could be something as simple as, hey, we need to have more conversations amongst each other, have more team building. Let's encourage people to have group lunches or some sort of activities that don't cost much. Just engaging with each other more costs very little and can usually help move things in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Or fix the dress code because it came up so often.
Exactly. Great.
Well, and then it's just so interesting because when you think about dress codes, from my first, question when I hear things like that is, okay, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for in terms of why do we have this dress code? And then kind of like go from there as you make changes and communicate. And that kind of goes back to the communication piece. I mean, maybe there's something at play that folks don't even understand in terms of the why. Maybe there is no why. But that really, I think, underscores your point about the importance of communication.
Another one, and this is lead by example, lift others up. And here I'm thinking of recognition and rewards that are not necessarily just money, but giving kudos to someone who's doing a good job. So one of the organizations that Spectra worked with, there was a nonprofit, and they always had one of their volunteers was on the board. They were a non-voting member, but how important is that to get the voice of the volunteers at the board level? It was, I would guess, pretty darn important. And And just a little stat that I found, Gallup found in May 2024 that 51% of all US employees were watching for or actively seeking a new job. So, yeah, lead by example. Anything there from anybody? Moving on. Be prepared for the long game. And this is, I read somewhere and I'll forget where. It's estimated that embedding inclusive leadership across an organization will take 2 to 3 years of sustained effort. But open-ended comments, can give very important clues to things that can change more quickly or more easily, like the dress code. But others are going to take longer, like creating a well-run mentorship program or tying your mentorship program to KPIs or something like that. There's things that are going to just take a long time. But once you measure, communicate, and lead by example, you have to come up with some strategies that you think are going to work, and then do them.
We didn't get here overnight, so it's going to take a little bit of time to unravel, but we still need to show some sort of progress. That's important.
Yep.
If I can expand on that just very briefly, I would be very careful. One thing that I personally encourage people in the DEI space to avoid is to use language like that, because it's like, oh, it's not a race, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You're coming to me as a white male leader of an organization that I think is doing pretty damn well, thank you very much, and you're telling me that I have to do something that is going to be uncomfortable, that is going to anger a lot of my white employees, which, oh, by the way, happen to be the majority of my employees, and now you're telling me that I have to do it all over the place and that it's going to take a really long time to do it. And basically you give me all the ingredients I need to just like go running out the door and not listening to you. And I think that, in a way you've kind of addressed that already, which is the combination of measuring and look for simple things that can be done, whether it's a dress code issue or whether it's looking through inclusion data to find 1 or 2 activities that you can do right away. And as long as you have, because a lot of times I see people, the marathon and the long drawn out thing is also not an excuse, but it's a recognition that we're doing things that we really have no idea how well they're going to work and how long they're going to take. And that kind of thing does not inspire a lot of leaders to action. So I would just be really careful with that. I would personally not bring that up with leaders. I would say, let's figure out what early wins we can get to move forward, recognizing that, yes, some things take longer, but I would be very careful about kind of advertising that up front.
Good point. Because they've already, people that would be responsible for authorizing some of these changes, they probably only need a slight thing like saying it's going to be a marathon to discourage them from doing anything.
Yeah. A lot of these people, and this comes from, as an entrepreneur, if you ever tried to raise capital from venture capitalists, one of the things you learn is that all of these people are basically looking for any excuse to say no. Any excuse that they can say no is what they're looking for. So we just have to be very careful about not giving them excuses by making it sound difficult and lengthy and time consuming and costly and awkward and uncomfortable. Those are all things that in the mind of a CEO, they're like, oh, I don't want to do this. And then they may not tell you to your face that that's what's going on. But so I would just urge, I love the first 3 because they're very positive. The 4th one, I would just you could tweak that to make it a little bit less daunting to people.
Okay, thank you. And we're off to you, Nancy.
No, Nancy had to leave because it is 2 p.m. and I think that a lot of people need to drop off. In fact, I need to drop off shortly as well, but so maybe we should wrap up quickly.
Yep, we are wrapping up. Oh my goodness, it's time. Let's see, have we done these? We've done these before. So I'm just going to end it here then. Upcoming topics. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for coming and being one of our experts today. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Nance, even though she had to leave. And thank you, everybody else, for joining today as well.
All right,
Okay.
thanks. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
and there are a few things in the chat. If anybody is still on, let me just see what one
It looks
new.
like just some general
Oh,
comments.
I just,
Yeah.
people saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
got a bunch of thank yous.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.